She was standing on his porch when he rode in. A woman he had never met wearing his mother's ring on a chain around her neck, holding the documents that could save his ranch against her chest like a shield. Behind her stood his two brothers, and in the eyes of the middle one, the one called Beckett, Silas Calloway, saw something that stopped him colder than the Wyoming wind, something that had no right to be there, something that looked exactly like love. She had answered a stranger's letter. She had no idea three brothers were waiting on the other side. This is her story. She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, no welcoming face among the handful of strangers who drifted along the dirt street of Elk Ridge, Wyoming territory. Just the wind, the dust, and the enormous silence of a land that stretched in every direction like an ocean made of grass and sky. The driver tossed her carpet bag into the dust without ceremony. He clicked his tongue, snapped the reins, and the stagecoach lurched forward, wheels groaning horses, huffing, carrying away the last thread connecting Clara Whitfield to the world she had known. She stood alone on the empty boardwalk outside the general store, holding a letter in her left hand and everything she owned in one small bag at her feet. The letter said he would be waiting. The letter said, "I will be at the station when you arrive." The letter had lied. Or perhaps the letter had told the truth and the man who wrote it was simply gone. Dead, maybe. Lost in the vastness of the American West, swallowed by distance and silence the way so many men were swallowed. She did not know. She knew only that she had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger, and the stranger was not here, and the sun was sinking behind the mountains, and she had nowhere in this world to go. Clara Whitfield was 23 years old. She had 19 cents in the pocket of her navy blue traveling dress. She had a cameo brooch at her throat that had belonged to her mother. She had a Bible, a volume of Tennyson, two spare dresses, and a Constitution that had survived things far worse than an empty train platform in a town she could not find on a map. She would survive this too. She had to. 3 months earlier, Clara had been standing in a rented room above a tailor shop on Hanover Street in Boston, Massachusetts. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. The window looked out onto an alley where cats fought and rain collected in brown puddles between the cobblestones. The walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every cough, every crying child in the building. She had lived there for 3 years ever since the fire. The fire had taken everything. Her parents, their apartment, every photograph, every book, every piece of her childhood. She had been at the church teaching Sunday school when it happened. She came home to smoke and shouting in a crowd of strangers watching the building burn while her mother and father burned inside it. She was 20 years old. She had no siblings, no aunts or uncles, no one in the world who shared her blood. For 3 years she survived. She worked 6 days a week as a seamstress for Mrs. Peabody's dress shop on the ground floor of her building, earning barely enough to cover rent and bread. On Sundays, she taught reading to children at the church on Fleet Street. Those were the only hours of the week that felt like living rather than merely surviving. She was educated. Her father, a clerk, had insisted on schooling for his daughter. She could read, write, do sums, and quote Shakespeare from memory. None of these skills had kept her warm or fed. The landlord raised the rent in December. Mrs. Peabody announced in January that the shop was closing, beaten by a factory that produced dresses faster and cheaper. Clara did the arithmetic. Within 2 months, she would be out of work. Within 3, she would be out of money. After that came the boarding house, then the street, then the poorhouse. She had seen what happened to women without resources or family in Boston. She had visited the poorhouse once with the church. She would die before she went there. It was in this state, at this precise intersection of intelligence, pride, loneliness, and fear, that she found the advertisement. She discovered it in a discarded copy of the Boston Herald left on a church pew after Sunday service. The notice was small, tucked between advertisements for patent medicines and farm equipment. Wanted a woman of good character and industrious spirit for marriage. Rancher in Wyoming territory seeks wife. Must be willing to work hard, endure frontier life, and build a future together. Write to S. Calloway, Elk Ridge, Wyoming territory. She read it 3 times. First with disbelief, then with curiosity, then with a careful, logical consideration that surprised even herself. She was not a romantic fool. She knew what a mail-order bride arrangement meant, a transaction between strangers, a gamble with no guarantee, But she also knew what staying in Boston meant, and the arithmetic of despair was simpler than the arithmetic of hope. She wrote the letter that same evening. It was precise, honest, and dignified. She described herself truthfully, her age, her education, her skills, her situation. She did not embellish or plead. She asked practical questions. What is the ranch like? What would be expected of her? Is there a town nearby? She signed it respectfully, Miss Clara Whitfield, and mailed it the next morning with her last stamp. 6 weeks later, a reply arrived. The handwriting was firm and careful. The handwriting of a man unaccustomed to letters, but determined to make his words count. Silas Calloway wrote that he was 32 years old, the eldest of three brothers, and that they ran a cattle ranch called Calloway Creek Ranch, 15 miles west of Elk Ridge. He wrote that the ranch had 600 acres of grazing land, a house, a barn, and a creek that ran year-round. He wrote that life on the frontier was hard but honest, and that he was looking for a partner, not a servant. He would send money for her stagecoach fare if she agreed. Clara noted what was absent from the letter. No mention of love, no promise of affection, no flowery sentiment. This was a business arrangement, and Silas Calloway treated it as such. She respected him for it. She would have been suspicious of poetry from a stranger. Plain honesty she could trust. 3 more letters passed between them over the next month, each one longer than the last. Silas described the Wyoming landscape. The way the mountains looked at dawn, purple and gold and enormous against the pale sky. The sound of wind through the prairie grass like a river you could hear but never see. The stars at night so close and so many that a person could forget there was such a thing as darkness. Clara described her teaching her love of books, her memories of her parents. Neither of them wrote anything intimate or presumptuous, but something built in the space between the lines. A cautious, careful warmth that neither of them named. In his last letter, Silas wrote something that kept Clara awake for 2 nights. I will be at the station when you arrive. I give you my word. A man keeps his word. That was what her father used to say. A man keeps his word, or he is not a man worth knowing. Clara folded the letter into her Bible, gave notice to Mrs. Peabody, paid her final rent, packed her single carpet bag, and took the stagecoach west. The journey lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of rattling, bruising, bone-jarring, travel across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the great flat expanse of the plains. Each day the landscape changed. The cities shrank to towns, the towns to settlements, the settlements to solitary homesteads miles apart. The sky widened, the horizon retreated. Clara watched through the dusty window as her old life fell away behind her like a shawl dropped on a road she would never walk again. She shared the coach with a rotating cast of fellow travelers. A hardware salesman who talked without ceasing about profit margins on iron nails. A preacher's wife returning to her husband in Kansas with a crate of hymnals on her lap. A silent fur trader whose leather coat smelled of smoke and animal fat. Each companion came and went at various stops, and Clara learned to sleep sitting upright, to eat cold biscuits and jerky without complaint, to ignore the bruises that bloomed along her ribs from the constant jolting over rutted roads. She wrote in a small journal during the quieter stretches. It is as if someone has ironed the earth flat and hung the sky twice as high, she wrote when she first saw the Great Plains. I have never felt so small. I have never felt so free. She wrote about a sunset so red it looked like the sky was bleeding. About a coyote on a ridge watching the stagecoach with yellow eyes. And one night, very late, when sleep would not come, what if he does not want me when he sees me? What if I do not want him? What if this is the greatest mistake of my life? And then underneath in firmer handwriting, what if it is not? At the final relay station before Elk Ridge, Clara washed her face in a tin basin, brushed the dust from her dress, and repinned her hair with trembling fingers. She touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's last gift, the only object connecting her to her old life. She drew a breath that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs and climbed back into the stagecoach for the last time. Now she stood in Elk Ridge, and the stagecoach was gone, and no one was coming. She waited 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. She sat on the bench outside the general store and watched the street with the careful composure of a woman who had learned to keep her fear behind her face. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her back was straight, Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The general store owner noticed her eventually. He was an older man with a gray beard and kind eyes, wiping his hands on an apron as he stepped onto the boardwalk. "You waiting for someone, Miss Silas Calloway," Clara said. His expression shifted. Surprise first, then discomfort. "Silas, he has been gone near 3 months now. Took a herd down to Texas for a cattle buyer. Nobody has heard from him in a while." He paused. "You are not the mail-order bride, are you?" The way he said it, the slight widening of his eyes, the careful, almost pitying tone. Clara absorbed it and kept her face still. "I am Miss Clara Whitfield. Mr. Calloway and I have an arrangement." The store owner, whose name was Gus Harmon, arranged for old Jeb Wheeler, a local freighter, to drive Clara out to the Calloway Ranch in his wagon. The ride was 15 miles long and bumpy through rolling prairie dotted with sagebrush and cottonwood trees along the creek bottoms. Jeb was a kind man who occasionally pointed out landmarks: a ridge where antelope grazed, a creek bed, a stand of cottonwoods turning gold in the late October light. Clara absorbed none of it. Her mind was spinning. 3 months gone, no word. She had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a ghost. The Calloway Creek Ranch came into view as the sun began to lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The land opened into a wide valley with mountains rising on both sides, blue-gray and snow-capped against the enormous sky. The ranch itself was a sturdy log house with a stone chimney, a large barn, a corral with several horses, and beyond it all, the creek that gave the ranch its name, a winding ribbon of water catching the last light of day. The land was beautiful, wide and green with late-season grass, the kind of landscape that made a person feel very small and strangely free at the same time. Jeb pulled the wagon up to the house and called out. A dog barked somewhere behind the barn, and then the front door opened and a man stepped onto the porch. He was tall. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Tall and broad and built the way men are built when their bodies have been shaped by labor rather than leisure. He had light brown hair pushed back carelessly under a sweat-stained hat and eyes the color of whiskey that caught the fading light with a sharp, almost dangerous edge. His jaw was tight, his arms were crossed. His entire posture said, "You are not welcome here." "Who are you?" he said. Clara stepped down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could manage after 15 miles of rutted road. She straightened her dress. She lifted her chin. "Clara Whitfield, I am here to marry Silas Calloway." He placed an advertisement in the Boston Herald, and we have been corresponding by letter for the past 3 months. The man stared at her, then at her carpet bag, then back at her face. He did what? The disbelief on his face was genuine, not performative, not exaggerated, real shock hardening into something darker as the implications settled. This man, whoever he was, had not known about the advertisement. Silas Calloway had placed a marriage notice in a Boston newspaper and had not told a soul in his own family. "I am Beckett Calloway," the man said, his voice low and controlled, in the way of someone holding back a much louder version of himself. "Silas is my brother, and he did not mention a goddamn word about this to me or anyone else." Clara held out the letter. Beckett took it, read it once, read it again, and his jaw tightened further with each line. His knuckles whitened around the paper's edge. At that moment, a second man appeared from behind the barn, younger, leaner, with auburn red hair that caught the last of the sunlight and wood shavings dusting his shoulders. His eyes were the same amber as his brother's, but softer, warmer, carrying a gentleness that his older brother's gaze entirely lacked. He stopped when he saw Clara's surprise plain on his face, and then he did something his brother had not done. He removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "you must be tired from traveling. Come inside." Beckett turned on him. "She is not coming inside. Silas is not here. He might never be coming back. We are not taking in some stranger because our brother lost his mind." The younger man held his ground. He did not raise his voice. He did not square his shoulders or clench his fists. He simply stood where he was and spoke with the quiet, steady authority of a man who knew exactly what was right. "She came 1,000 miles, Beckett. We are not sending her away tonight." This was Jonah Calloway, 24 years old, the youngest of 3 brothers, the one who built things with his hands and read poetry by lamplight and carried somewhere deep inside the quiet grief of a mother he had never known because she had died bringing him into the world. The silence between the brothers lasted 5 full seconds. 5 seconds in which Clara Whitfield stood on the hard-packed dirt of the Callaway Ranch yard with her carpetbag at her feet and her future balanced on the outcome of a staring contest between two men she had never met. Beckett looked away first. He turned without a word and walked back inside the door, slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Jonah exhaled slowly and turned to Clara with an expression that was equal parts apology and welcome. "Come on in, Miss Whitfield. There is stew from yesterday. It is not much, but it is hot." They brought her inside. The ranch house was simple but solid. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with an iron stove and rough-hewn counters, a wooden table with 4 chairs. Clara noticed the fourth chair, the empty seat. Silas Calloway's place at the table, vacant and waiting. A hallway led to 3 bedrooms. 2 doors stood open. The third was shut. "That is Silas's room," Beckett had said from the far side of the kitchen, where he leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. His voice was flat, final. "Do not go in there." Jonah heated stew over the stove while Clara sat at the table. Both brothers sat across from her, and an awkward silence filled the room like smoke. Beckett watched her the way a man watches a rattlesnake he has discovered in his kitchen. Not with malice exactly, but with a readiness for something to go wrong. Jonah watched her with quiet curiosity, the kind of gentle attention that made her feel seen rather than examined. Clara ate slowly, deliberately, because her hands were shaking and she would not let them see it. When the bowls were empty and the silence had stretched past, Clara spoke. She laid out her situation with the same precise honesty she had used in her very first letter to Silas. She had no money to return east. She had no family, no home, no employment waiting for her. She had come here in good faith based on a written agreement with their brother. She understood that Silas was not here. She understood that his brothers owed her nothing. But she asked. She did not beg. She asked. "I will work," she said, meeting their eyes in turn. "I can cook clean, sew tend animals, keep accounts, and teach reading. I am not helpless. I will earn my keep until your brother returns and can deal with this himself." Beckett's response was immediate and harsh. "We do not need a wife. We need our brother back. And we sure as hell do not need another mouth to feed when we can barely—" He stopped himself. The sentence he almost finished hung in the air between them, more revealing than anything he could have said. "When we can barely keep this ranch alive." Jonah spoke into the silence. "She stays, at least until Silas comes home." He looked at Beckett with a steady gaze that carried more weight than his years should have allowed. "It is what Silas would want." Beckett stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. He crossed the room in 3 strides and went outside. The door did not slam this time. It closed with a deliberate, controlled force that was somehow worse than a slam. Through the window, Clara watched him stride to the barn, his shoulders rigid with fury. Jonah sighed. "Do not take it personal, Miss Whitfield. Beckett is angry at Silas, not at you. He just does not know how to aim it right." That night, Clara lay on a narrow cot in the small guest room. It was barely more than a storage closet with a mattress. She could hear the wind outside, bigger and wilder than any wind she had heard in Boston. She could hear the creak, the occasional stamp of a horse in the barn. She was farther from home than she had ever been, and the man she had come to marry was somewhere out in the vast darkness of the West, alive or dead, humming an organum, a stranger whose careful letters had brought her to this porch, this room, this moment. She folded her hands over her chest and whispered into the dark. "I will not be afraid. I will not be broken. Winter always ends." She did not know where those last 3 words came from. They simply arrived the way certain truths arrive in the darkest hours. She held them against her chest like a lantern and closed her eyes. The first weeks on the ranch were a trial by callous and exhaustion. Clara rose before dawn every morning. She learned to collect eggs without being pecked, though not before a particularly aggressive hen drew blood on her wrist that she quietly bandaged and never mentioned. She burned the first 3 batches of biscuits so badly that even the ranch dog would not eat them. On the 4th try, she produced something edible, and Jonah said, "These are good," with such genuine surprise that Clara almost laughed. She tore her only work dress on a fence nail the second day and mended it that evening by lamplight. Her soft Boston hands cracked and blistered within the first week. From hauling water, from scrubbing cast iron pots with sand, from gripping the rough handles of garden tools. She developed calluses in places she did not know calluses could form. Her back ached from bending. Her shoulders burned from carrying. She fell asleep each night within minutes of lying down, so exhausted that dreams could not find her. But the transformation was happening, slowly, painfully, beautifully. The morning she kneaded bread dough without her arms trembling. The afternoon she saddled the brown mare alone for the first time, checking the cinch the way Jonah had taught her, pulling it snug against the horse's belly. The evening she looked at her reflection in the wash basin and saw beneath the sunburn and the windburn a woman she barely recognized. Harder, leaner, more alive than the pale seamstress who had left Boston. Beckett ignored her. He spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. Move. Close the gate. Do not touch that. He was not cruel. He was cold, and the coldness was deliberate. A wall built with purpose and maintained with effort. But walls have cracks, and Clara noticed every one. One morning she struggled to lift a hay bale onto the wagon. The bale was nearly as large as she was. She heaved it to her waist, lost her grip, and it tumbled back to the ground. She tried again, failed again. On the third attempt, Beckett appeared beside her without a sound, lifted the bale with one arm, as though it weighed nothing, tossed it onto the wagon bed, and walked away before she could open her mouth. He did not look back. Another time she was trying to mend a section of fence wire in the rain, her hair plastered to her face, fingers slipping on the wet metal. Beckett materialized at her elbow, took the pliers from her hand, twisted the wire into place in 30 seconds, and handed the pliers back. "You will cut yourself," he said. That was all, not kindness exactly. Efficiency, but the fact that he noticed, the fact that he came. One evening, Beckett returned from the corral, late exhausted and filthy from a long day breaking a half-wild gelding. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. His torn work shirt, the one he had shrugged off that morning and tossed over the back of a chair, was washed, mended with small, neat stitches, and folded beside a plate of supper, still warm under a cloth. Clara was not there. She had gone to bed an hour earlier. Beckett stood in the empty kitchen, holding the mended shirt. The firelight flickered across his face, and for a moment something shifted in his expression. Something opened that he immediately tried to close. He sat down. He ate the supper. He did not thank her in the morning. But the next day, without a word, he fixed the loose hinge on her bedroom door that she had not mentioned to anyone. Jonah became Clara's quiet ally in those first weeks. He showed her how to pump water from the well, timing the handle so the water came in a steady stream rather than a grudging trickle. He taught her to read the weather by the shape of the clouds. Flat-bottom clouds meant fair weather. A greenish tint to the west meant hail coming. Wind shifting from south to north meant a storm within 6 hours. He taught her to ride. Really ride, not the nervous perching she had managed on the mare's back. He showed her how to hold the reins. Gentle. Do not pull. The horse feels everything through the bit. You are guiding, not commanding. He showed her how to use her knees against the horse's sides to turn, how to sit the trot by relaxing her hips and letting her body follow the horse's rhythm. His hand steadied her elbow when she lost balance. Neither of them acknowledged the contact. One evening, Jonah noticed the book of poetry in Clara's room. "What is this one?" he asked, picking it up. "Tennyson," she said. "My father loved him." Jonah opened to a random page and read a line aloud. His reading was halting but genuine, each word given careful weight. Clara watched his face as he sounded out the syllables, and something softened in her. Not romantic love, something else. A deep, immediate tenderness for this young man who built barns with his hands and read poetry by lamplight and carried carved into the beam above the fireplace the name of a mother he had never known. Sarah. She began teaching him to read better. Evenings by the fire, sitting side by side, her finger tracing words on the page, her voice soft as she read first and he repeated. From across the room, Beckett sat in the shadows, greasing a leather harness, pretending not to listen. But sometimes his hands went still, and his eyes lifted from the leather to watch the lamplight falling on Clara's honey-colored hair, and something in his expression was so raw and unguarded that it would have broken her heart if she had seen it. She did not see it. Jonah did. Martha Davies arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning of Clara's second week riding a dappled mare, with the confidence of a woman who had been in the saddle longer than she had been on her feet. She was 59 years old, weathered and sharp-eyed with silver-threaded hair, pulled back in a practical knot, and hands that had buried a husband, a son, and enough grief to drown in. She had not drowned. She had kept going because that was what women on the frontier did. They kept going. Martha studied Clara from the back of her horse with the appraising eye of a woman who had seen a great many young brides come and go on the Wyoming frontier. "You are the mail-order bride," she said, not a question. "I prefer the woman who answered an honest letter," Clara replied. Martha's bark of laughter was the warmest sound Clara had heard since arriving in Wyoming. She dismounted, tied her horse, and took Clara's arm as though they had known each other for years. "Oh, I like you. Come for supper tomorrow. Bring nothing. I have opinions about the Calloway boys that you need to hear." Over cups of strong tea in Martha's kitchen the next evening, Clara learned the history of the Calloway family. How Henry Calloway had built the ranch from nothing in the years after the war, driving cattle up from Texas and claiming land under the Homestead Act. How his wife Sarah had come west with him, a Virginia girl who could quote scripture and shoot a rifle with equal accuracy. How Sarah had died giving birth to Jonah, and how Henry had never fully recovered. He drank for years, let the debts pile up, then sobered up too late, and died of a heart attack when Silas was 24, leaving the eldest boy to raise two younger brothers and save a ranch that was already drowning. Martha spoke of each brother with the fondness of a woman who had watched them grow up and the candor of a woman who saw them clearly. "Silas is the best of them," she said, pouring more tea. "Honest to a fault, carries the world on his shoulders, and never once complains. If he placed that advertisement, he had his reasons. That man does not do anything without thinking it through 6 ways." She paused. "Beckett is a storm looking for a place to land. He is angry because he is scared. Scared of losing the ranch, scared of losing his brother, scared of needing anyone. Push him, and he will push back twice as hard. Wait him out, and eventually he will come to you." She fixed Clara with sharp eyes. "Jonah is the quiet river. He sees everything. He carries more than you think." She set down her cup. "You can trust all three of them, but you will need patience, especially with Beckett." Clara nodded slowly. "Martha, why are you helping me?" "You do not know me." Martha's eyes softened with something old and deep. "Because I was you once. 40 years ago, I came west with nothing but a carpet bag and a prayer. A woman helped me when nobody else would. She has been dead 20 years now, but I still owe her. So I help you, and someday you help the next girl who steps off a stagecoach into nothing." She smiled. "Winter always ends, girl, but you have to survive it first." That night, unable to sleep, Clara did something she had been wanting to do since the first day. She opened the door to Silas Calloway's room. It was unlocked. Inside, she found a Spartan space, a narrow bed with a wool blanket folded at the foot, a trunk against the wall, a desk beneath the window scarred and stained with years of use, and on the desk, stacked with the careful organization of a man who valued order letters. Dozens of them, some from cattle buyers, some from a land agent in Cheyenne. Receipts records the paper trail of a man trying to hold a ranch together with willpower and arithmetic. And one letter folded and sealed but never mailed with her name written on the front in Silas Calloway's firm, careful hand. Clara's fingers trembled as she opened it. "Dear Miss Whitfield, if you are reading this, I have not returned as I promised. I write this as a precaution, nothing more. If anything should happen to me on the drive, I ask that you know this. I placed the advertisement because I believed this ranch needed a woman's hand and heart to survive. My brothers are good men, but they cannot do this alone. If I do not come back, please do not feel bound to stay. But if you choose to stay, know that you are welcome, that the ranch is as much yours as theirs, and that any man would be honored to have you." Below the signature, in smaller, more hurried handwriting, a postscript. "If I do not come back, make sure she is taken care of. She deserves better than a dead man's promises." Clara read the letter twice. The "she" in the postscript. Was it Clara? Or was it someone else? The ranch itself, perhaps the land he loved? Or a woman he had not mentioned in any of his other letters? She folded the letter and returned it to the desk. She did not tell the brothers what she had found. But that night, lying in her small room with the wind pressing against the cabin walls, she made a decision that was not about Silas or Beckett or Jonah. It was about herself. She would not leave. Not because she owed anyone, Not because she had nowhere to go, because this ranch needed her. And for the first time since her parents died, she needed to be needed. The decision settled into her bones like warmth returning to a body that had been cold for a very long time. She closed her eyes. She whispered the words that were becoming her prayer. A man keeps his word, and so does a woman. The knock came on a Thursday afternoon. Not the casual rap of a neighbor, but the formal, deliberate knock of someone who wanted to be heard. Clara was alone at the house. Beckett and Jonah were in the south pasture mending fence line that a bull had knocked through the previous night. She opened the door. Victor Harding stood on the porch. He was 56 years old, silver-haired, immaculately dressed in an Eastern-style suit with a gold watch chain across his vest and polished boots that had never touched a corral. His eyes were blue and cold and intelligent. His smile was wide and warm and did not reach those eyes by a considerable distance. Behind him, a hired man sat in the driver's seat of a polished black buggy. The hired man's hand rested casually near his hip. "Good afternoon," Harding said, removing his hat with a flourish. "I do not believe we have met. I am Victor Harding. I own a number of businesses here in Elk Ridge, and you must be the young lady the whole town has been talking about." "Clara Whitfield," she said. She did not offer her hand. Something about this man, about the careful arrangement of his smile, about the way his eyes catalogued her from head to toe, without seeming to move, told her to keep her hands at her sides and her back against the doorframe. Charming. Absolutely charming. Harding's gaze swept the ranch yard, the barn, the corral with the assessing look of a man pricing inventory. "I was hoping to speak with the Calloway brothers. A business matter. But since they are not here, perhaps you would be kind enough to pass along a message." He reached into his coat and produced a document. Thick paper, official looking. He held it out to her and Clara took it because refusing would have felt like flinching, and she would not flinch in front of this man. It was a promissory note, $2,000 dated 3 years prior, bearing what appeared to be Henry Calloway's signature. According to this document, the Calloway brothers' father had borrowed $2,000 from Victor Harding shortly before his death using the ranch as collateral. The note had come due. Full payment was required within 60 days. Clara read the document carefully. Her face revealed nothing. But behind her composed expression, her mind was racing, turning over details the way her father had taught her. The ink, the paper, the signature. "I will give this to the brothers when they return," she said evenly. "Much obliged." Harding tipped his hat. 60 days, Miss Whitfield. The law is very clear on these matters. I take no pleasure in it, of course. Henry Calloway was a friend, but a debt is a debt." He climbed into his buggy. As the hired man turned the horses, Harding looked back at Clara with an expression that was not a smile and not a threat, but something worse than either. Something that said, "I know exactly what I am doing, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." Clara watched the buggy until it disappeared over the ridge. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and studied the document again. Slowly, carefully, the way her father had taught her to examine ledgers at his accounting desk in Boston. Look at the ink. Look at the paper. Look at what does not match. The body of the note was written in dark, even ink. The signature at the bottom was slightly lighter, as though written with a different pen or at a different time. The date was written in a hand that did not quite match the hand that had written the text above it. These were small details. Easy to miss, easy to dismiss. But Clara Whitfield had spent 3 years as her father's clerk before his death, copying documents, checking figures, filing papers. She knew what a legitimate document looked like, and she knew with a certainty that sat cold and heavy in her stomach what a forged one looked like too. When Beckett and Jonah returned from the south pasture at dusk, dusty and tired and expecting nothing more than supper and silence, Clara was waiting at the table with the document laid out before her. Beckett read it first. His face drained of color and then flushed dark with fury. He threw the paper onto the table with a force that rattled the cups. "This is a lie, treaty," he said. His voice was barely controlled. "Our father never borrowed a cent from that snake. Never. Not once. Not ever." Jonah read it next. He was quieter than his brother, but his face told the same story in different language. Shock, disbelief, and beneath both a terrible uncertainty. Because their father had drunk. Their father had made mistakes in those final years, and neither of them could be completely sure what Henry Calloway had or had not done in the haze of whiskey and grief that had marked his last years on Earth. "May I see it again?" Clara asked. They looked at her, surprised perhaps that she would insert herself into family business. But she extended her hand, and after a moment Beckett slid the paper across the table. Clara studied it for a full minute in the lamplight before she spoke. "The ink of the signature does not match the ink of the text. It is lighter, possibly a different pen entirely. The date at the top is written in a hand that differs from the body of the document. Small differences, but noticeable if you know where to look." She looked up and met their eyes. "I am not an expert, but I was my father's clerk for years, and I have handled hundreds of legal documents. This one troubles me." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It was the silence of something shifting. Beckett looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face until this moment. Not warmth exactly. Recognition, as though he were seeing her for the first time, not as a burden or an inconvenience, but as a person who might be worth listening to. Jonah leaned back in his chair with a slow exhale. $2,000, he said quietly. "That is more than this ranch earns in 2 years." "Then we had better find a way to prove it is a forgery," Clara said, "because if we cannot, we lose everything." She did not say you lose everything. Well, she said we, and neither Beckett nor Jonah corrected her. The 60-day clock began ticking that night. From that moment forward, every scene at the Callaway Ranch, every conversation, every decision about feed and fencing and whether to sell a horse or keep it carried the weight of the deadline, pressing down on them like the low gray sky of an approaching storm. Clara wrote her first letter to the Territorial Banking Commission in Denver that same evening, requesting records of any loan transaction between Henry Callaway and Victor Harding. She wrote it by lamplight at the kitchen table while Beckett cleaned his rifle in the corner and Jonah read quietly by the fire. None of them spoke. But for the first time since Clara had arrived, the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had found themselves on the same side of the fight that they had not chosen, working together in the way that people work together when the alternative is losing everything. Outside, the wind blew cold from the north, the first breath of winter carrying the smell of snow from the high mountains. The creek sang its low, steady song in the darkness. And somewhere far to the south, beyond the mountains and the plains, in 1,000 miles of silence, a man named Silas Callaway rode slowly through the Texas dust, a gold ring in his saddlebag and a promise in his heart, not knowing that the woman he had written to, the woman he had never met, was already fighting for his home. Clara stood on the porch that night after the brothers had gone to bed. She looked out across the darkened prairie, the same vast emptiness that had terrified her 3 weeks ago. It did not terrify her now. It felt impossibly like it was becoming hers. The land, the sky, the wind that carried the scent of sage and coming snow. She touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's brooch, her only inheritance. "I am staying," she said to the wind, to the land, to the ghost of a man she had never met, whose honest letters had led her across a continent to this porch, this moment, this life she was building from nothing with her own 2 hands. Winter always ends, but first you have to survive it. The weeks that followed changed Clara Whitfield in ways that no letter could have predicted and no stagecoach could have carried her back from. She learned the ranch the way a person learns a language. Not all at once, but in pieces each day, adding a new word, a new sound, a new understanding of how this world worked. She learned that the brown mare's name was Copper, and that Copper would stand patient as stone while being saddled, but would bite if you forgot to check her mood first. She learned that the rooster crowed at 4:30 regardless of the season, and that arguing with a rooster was a battle no human had ever won. She learned that the well pump seized in cold weather and needed 3 hard strikes with the heel of her palm before the water would come. She learned the sounds of the ranch at night, the breathing of horses in the barn, low and rhythmic as a lullaby. The creek running over stones, a sound so constant it became a kind of silence. The wind through the gaps in the cabin walls, singing a note that was neither happy nor sad, but simply old, the sound of a land that had been here long before people and would be here long after. And she learned the brothers. Jonah was the easier study. He was open the way good timber is open, the grain visible, and honest, no hidden knots. He talked to her while they worked together, about the ranch, about the horses, about the way cottonwood trees drop their seeds in the spring like snow falling upward. He showed her how to check fence wire by tapping it and listening to the sound. A long, clear ring meant the wire was tight. A dull thud meant slack, and slack meant cattle would push through before morning. He taught her the names of the grasses. Blue grama, buffalo grass, western wheatgrass. Each one had a purpose. Each one told a story about the soil beneath it. He built her a small shelf for her books without being asked. 3 planks of pine sanded smooth fitted into the wall of her room with pegs he had carved himself. When she thanked him, he shrugged and said, "Books deserve a place to live," and went back to whatever he had been building before, which was always something. Beckett was the harder study. He remained a closed door, a locked room, a man who communicated primarily through silence and the occasional monosyllable. But Clara was learning to read the silences the way Jonah had taught her to read the clouds. There were different kinds. The hostile silence of the first days, sharp and cold as a blade. The working silence when they were both occupied with tasks, and the quiet was simply the absence of unnecessary noise. And a newer silence, one that had begun to appear in the last week or so that Clara could not quite name. It came when Beckett thought she was not looking. A silence that watched, a silence that noticed. She caught glimpses of it like light through a crack. The morning she was struggling to split kindling with a hand axe, placing the wood wrong, fighting the grain instead of following it. She did not hear him approach. He simply appeared at her shoulder, took the axe from her hand, and placed a piece of wood on the stump. "Follow the grain," he said. "See where the wood wants to split. Work with it, not against it." He brought the axe down in one clean motion, and the wood fell apart in 2 perfect halves. He handed the axe back and walked away. It was the most words he had spoken to her in a single moment, and every one of them applied to more than firewood. November deepened and the temperature dropped. The aspens on the high ridges turned gold, then amber, then bare. The prairie grass dried to a color like old honey, and the wind that came down from the mountains carried the first real bite of winter. The sky seemed lower, closer, pressing down on the land, with the weight of weather gathering itself for something serious. The ranch preparations for winter consumed every waking hour. Hay to cut and stack in the remaining barn, firewood to split and cord against the south wall of the house where it would stay driest, livestock to move to sheltered pastures in the creek bottom, the root cellar to fill with preserved vegetables, salted meat, and whatever Clara could coax from the garden before the first hard freeze. She threw herself into the work with a focus that bordered on obsession. Because if she stopped working, she started thinking. And thinking led to questions she could not answer. Was Silas alive or dead? Would the forged debt stand? Would they lose everything they had built? The clock ticked. 43 days remaining, then 40, then 35. Clara had nightmares. In one that came twice, she stood on the porch watching a rider approach across the prairie. Silas, she thought, finally home. But when the rider reached the yard, his face was blank, featureless, the face of a man who did not exist. She woke from these dreams, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind until her pulse steadied. She told no one. On a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week of November, Clara accompanied Jonah to Elk Ridge for supplies. It was her first visit to town since arriving, and the experience was illuminating in ways she had not anticipated. At the general store, a woman approached her. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with eyes that held a challenge and a mouth that looked accustomed to saying things other people only thought. She leaned against the counter with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this town in a way Clara did not yet belong. "So you are the one who answered the ad," the woman said. Her voice was pleasant enough, but beneath the pleasantness was something harder. "I am Rose McAllister. I work at the Dusty Trail. Silas and I go back a ways, you know. We had an understanding before he left." She let the word understanding hang in the air like smoke. "I always thought he would come home to me, but I suppose a letter from Boston is more exciting than a woman who has been here all along." Clara met Rose's gaze without flinching. 3 months ago, this confrontation would have undone her. But 3 months ago, she had not carried a foal through a barnyard or learned to split wood along the grain or stared down Beckett Calloway across a kitchen table and won. "If Silas wanted to marry you," Clara said quietly, "I expect he would have asked. He chose to write a letter instead. That tells me everything I need to know." Rose's smile hardened. She turned and left without another word. But outside, loading supplies into the wagon, Clara's hands trembled, and the doubt that Rose had planted took root in the soft soil of her uncertainty. What if Rose was telling the truth? What if Silas had left behind more than brothers and cattle? Jonah addressed it on the ride home, his voice gentle as the reins in his hands. Rose and Silas were close once, but it ended before he left. That is the truth of it. He paused, choosing his next words with care. Silas chose you, Miss Whitfield. A man keeps his word. He would not have written those letters if he did not mean every line. That same Sunday at the church social, following the service, Clara met Garrett Pemberton for the first time. He was 27, the son of the town banker. Well-dressed in a way that stood out among the ranch hands and settlers like a pressed flower in a field of wild grass. He was educated back east, well-spoken, and immediately attentive to Clara, in a way that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. He brought her a glass of lemonade before she could reach the table herself. He asked about Boston with genuine interest. He quoted a line of Emerson that she recognized and completed, and his face lit up with the delight of a man who had been starving for intellectual conversation. He made her laugh, a real laugh, full and surprised, the first one that had escaped her since arriving in Wyoming. And across the churchyard, leaning against the fence with a cup of cider in his hand, Beckett Calloway watched. His jaw was set. His eyes were dark. When Clara's gaze found his across the crowd, he looked away, but not fast enough. And not before she saw something in his expression that she was not supposed to see. Something raw and unguarded, and immediately shuddered like a lantern flame blown out by a sudden wind. The night of the fire came in the middle of November. Clara was in the barn tending the sick foal she had been nursing for 2 weeks. The little horse had been born small and weak, and Clara had appointed herself its guardian with a stubbornness that even Beckett did not challenge. She slept in the barn on the worst nights, wrapped in a horse blanket, on a pile of straw, the foal's head resting against her hip. Beckett and Jonah were in town that evening for a livestock auction. Clara was alone. She heard the horses first. Not the familiar rhythms of the ranch animals, but strangers, hard-ridden and coming fast. She pressed her eye to a crack in the barn wall and saw 3 riders in the yard, masked, carrying torches. They did not slow down. They rode straight to the hay barn 50 yards from where she crouched and threw their torches through the open door. The hay caught like paper soaked in kerosene. A wall of orange flame erupted with a sound like a giant drawing breath, and within seconds the entire structure was a furnace throwing sparks across the gap toward the main barn where Clara stood with 6 horses and a sick foal. She did not run. She did not scream. She did not freeze. Clara Whitfield opened the barn doors and went to work. She led the horses out one by one, fighting their panic with steady hands, and a voice that did not waver even though her heart was slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. 6 horses, each one wild-eyed and fighting the halter, each one outweighing her by 1,000 pounds. She led them to the far corral and tied them to the fence and went back for the next one and the next one and the next. The foal could not walk well. Its legs were too weak, too new, too uncertain for the chaos of fire and smoke. Clara gathered it in her arms and carried it. 40 pounds of trembling horse pressed against her chest, its small heart hammering against hers. She staggered across the yard, embers raining down around her, the heat enormous against her face. A spark caught the sleeve of her dress, and she beat it out against her hip without stopping. She set the foal down beside the corral fence and turned back to the main barn. The fire had not reached it yet, but the sparks were landing on the roof, on the walls, finding the dry wood and beginning to glow. Clara grabbed a bucket from the trough and threw water against the nearest wall. Again, her arms screaming, her lungs burning from the soak, her hands raw from the bucket handle. That was how Beckett found her. He and Jonah had seen the glow on the horizon from 3 miles out and ridden hard enough to lather their horses white. Beckett was off his saddle before the animal stopped running toward the fire, and then he saw Clara, soot-covered, singed, standing alone between the burning hay barn and the main barn, with a bucket in her blistered hands and a look on her face that was not fear and was not courage, but something beyond both. The look of a woman who had decided that this barn would not burn tonight and had made it so by the sheer force of her will. Beckett reached her, and for one unguarded moment, one moment he could never take back and would never want to. He pulled her against his chest with both arms, his face pressed into her hair, His hands gripped her shoulders as though she might disappear. Are you hurt, Clara? Are you hurt? First time he had used her given name. First time his voice had cracked on anything other than anger. She pushed back, met his eyes. The horses are safe. Help me with the barn wall. They fought the fire together through the night, the three of them passing buckets and beating embers and soaking the barn walls until the hay barn collapsed into a heap of glowing coals and the danger passed. In the gray light of dawn, they sat on the porch steps, filthy and exhausted. Three people who had been strangers 5 weeks ago and were something else now. Something that did not have a name yet. Harding, Beckett said, staring at the smoking ruin. Not a question. We cannot prove it, Jonah said quietly. I do not need to prove it. I will kill him. No, Clara's voice was hoarse from smoke but steady. If you kill him, you prove you are exactly what he says you are. Violent, lawless, unfit to own this land. We fight him with the truth or we lose everything. Actions, not words, Beckett. We prove what we are by what we do. Beckett stared at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw with things that had no name and no place to land. He looked away first. He always looked away first. After that night, something changed between them. Beckett did not become warm. He was not capable of warmth in the way that the word is usually understood. But he became present. He told her things about the ranch, explained decisions about which cattle to sell and which to keep, asked her opinion on feed purchases, started saying good morning when he came in for breakfast. These were small things. From a man like Beckett Calloway, they were everything. Garrett Pemberton continued his courtship through the autumn weeks. He visited the ranch with gifts, a book of Emily Dickinson's poetry for Clara, seed packets for her garden, a new bridle for Copper, the brown mare. He was unfailingly polite to the brothers. He sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and made conversation with the ease of a man accustomed to parlors and dining rooms. He was everything the Calloway brothers were not: polished, comfortable, safe. One evening, he asked Clara to walk with him along the creek. The air was cold, the first stars just appearing. Their breath made small clouds that dissolved into the darkness. I admire you, Clara, Garrett said, and his voice carried a sincerity that she could not dismiss. Your courage, your intelligence, coming all this way alone, building a life in a place like this. My father would welcome you into our family. I am offering you a good life, a comfortable life. You would not have to work yourself on a ranch that may not survive the winter. Clara looked at the creek, at the stars reflected in the dark water, at the Lennis she had come to love with a ferocity that still surprised her. Garrett, you are a good man, a kind man, but I made a promise, not just to Silas but to myself. I came here to build something. I am not finished building. He accepted her answer with grace, but his eyes said he would be back. And she knew with a clarity that troubled her that Garrett Pemberton was the easier choice, the sensible choice, the choice her mother would have approved of. But Clara noticed something that troubled her more. When Garrett spoke, she listened with her mind. When Beckett spoke those rare, rough, economical words that seemed to cost him something, each time they left his mouth, she listened with her whole body. When Garrett touched her hand to help her into his buggy, she felt gratitude. When Beckett's shoulder brushed hers while they worked side by side mending fence, she felt something run through her bones, like lightning finding ground. She hated herself for the comparison. The heart she was learning was not a rational organ. The letter arrived in early December. It had been forwarded through 3 different post offices, battered and stained from weeks of travel. It was addressed to the family of Silas Calloway. Clara opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon while the brothers were in the south pasture. Dear Mr. Calloway's family, it is my solemn duty to inform you that Silas Calloway, late of Wyoming Territory, was killed on the 27th of August during a cattle stampede near the Red River crossing in Texas. His remains were buried at the site. His personal effects, consisting of a saddlebag and contents, are being held at the post office in Fort Worth. We offer our deepest condolences. Signed, James P. Whitmore, Trail Boss, Whitmore Cattle Company. Clara read it 3 times. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes did not water. She simply stopped. Stopped breathing. Stopped thinking. stopped being the woman she had been becoming over these weeks and months. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the letter and felt the ground open beneath her like a trap door into a darkness that had no bottom. Silas was dead. The man she had traveled 1,000 miles to marry. The man whose letter she carried in her carpetbag. The man whose room she had entered in secret, whose journal she had read, whose careful, honest words had led her across a continent to this table, this kitchen, this life. He was dead in the Texas dust, buried by strangers, gone. Clara put her head down on the table and wept. Not graceful tears, the ugly, wrenching sobs of a woman mourning a future that had existed only in letters and dreams. She wept for the wedding that would never happen, for the children they would never have, for the life on this land that she had just begun to imagine as real and possible, and hers. She wept for herself, for the girl who had been brave enough to answer an advertisement in a newspaper and foolish enough to believe that bravery would be rewarded. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were swollen and her face was streaked, but something in her expression had hardened. Grief in Clara Whitfield did not lead to collapse. It led to resolve. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She folded the letter carefully. She placed it in the pocket of her apron. And then she began preparing supper because the living still needed to eat and the ranch still needed to run, and she would be damned if she let Victor Harding win by watching her fall apart. When Beckett and Jonah returned from the fields, Clara could not speak. She held out the letter. Jonah read it and broke. Quiet, shuddering sobs that he tried to hide by turning toward the wall. His shoulders shook. His hands pressed flat against the rough wood as though he needed something solid to keep him from falling. Beckett read it and went still. Absolutely, terrifyingly still. The kind of stillness that comes before an avalanche or the moment before a wounded animal charges. He set the letter on the table with exaggerated care, the way a man handles something explosive. He walked outside. He saddled his horse. He rode into the darkness without a word. He did not return until dawn. When he came back, his knuckles were split and bleeding, and he said nothing about where he had been or what he had broken with his fists. The days that followed were the darkest in the story of the Callaway Ranch. The place operated on reflex. Chores were done. Animals were fed. Fences were mended. But all the life had drained from the work the way color drains from a landscape when clouds cover the sun. Jonah retreated into building. He worked on the barn expansion from dawn to dusk, the steady rhythm of his hammer, the only heartbeat in the silence. Beckett worked the cattle alone, staying in the fields until dark, eating separately, sleeping in the barn. And Clara had to choose. Silas was dead. The debt was due in 5 weeks. The ranch would almost certainly be seized. She had no obligation to stay. Garrett Pemberton had made his offer. Martha had offered her a room. But Clara looked at these two brothers, these broken, stubborn, proud, difficult men who had lost their parents and now their eldest brother, and she could not leave. She thought of Silas's unfinished letter. Make sure she is taken care of. She deserves better than a dead man's promises. She understood now, finally, completely. The she was the ranch, the land, the life Silas had dreamed of building. Clara stayed, and she began to fight. She wrote to the Territorial Banking Commission in Denver requesting records. She wrote to the Fort Worth Post Office requesting Silas's personal effects. She reorganized the ranch finances, calculating what could be sold, what could be borrowed, what could be cut. She worked alongside the brothers from dawn to dark and then sat at the table with the lamp. Burning, writing letters, studying the debt document, planning. This was Clara at her strongest and most alone, grieving a man she had never met, mourning the possibility of him, and channeling that grief into fierce, stubborn, determined action. The blizzard came in the second week of December. It arrived without the courtesy of warning. 1 hour the sky was gray and still. The next hour the world disappeared behind a wall of white so thick that Clara could not see the barn from the front porch. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the kitchen bucket grew a skin of ice while she watched. Clara was at Martha's homestead when the storm hit. She had gone to deliver preserved vegetables and had planned to return by mid-afternoon, but the sky turned from gray to white to nothing, and suddenly the trail home was gone, erased. Every landmark she had learned in the past weeks vanished under a featureless blanket of driving snow. She tried to ride back anyway. She knew the trail. She had ridden it a dozen times. but the snow erased all reference points. The wind was deafening, a roar that swallowed every other sound and pressed against her like a physical force. Copper stumbled twice. Clara reached the creek crossing and found it swollen with snowmelt and ice running fast and dark between its banks. She dismounted to lead the mare across on foot. The water hit her like a fist of cold, chest deep, moving fast, so cold that her lungs locked and refused to draw breath. She made it across, hauling herself up the far bank on her hands and knees, but she could not remount. Her hands were numb. Her legs were failing. Her wet clothes were already beginning to freeze against her body. She stumbled along the creek bank, calling out, but her voice was a whisper against the howling wind. The cold was inside her now, inside her blood, inside her bones, pulling her down into a drowsiness that she recognized even through the fog as death knocking politely at the door. She collapsed against the trunk of a cottonwood tree. The snow was already covering her. She thought of her mother's cameo brooch. She thought of Silas's letters. She thought of Beckett's face in the firelight, the night of the barn fire, the moment he had pulled her against him and said her name. She thought winter always ends, but not always for everyone. Beckett found her. He rode into the blizzard against Jonah's desperate protests, against every shred of common sense and self-preservation, following the trail he knew she would have taken, shouting her name into the whiteout until his voice was raw. He found her curled against the cottonwood, barely conscious, her lips blue, her body shaking with violent tremors that were the body's last defense against the cold. He pulled her onto his horse. He wrapped his coat around her, leaving himself exposed to the wind and the snow in nothing but a shirt. He rode back to the ranch in near-zero visibility, navigating by instinct, and the horse's memory talking to her the entire way. "Stay with me, Clara. Stay awake. Do not close your eyes. We are almost there. Stay with me." At the ranch, Jonah had prepared everything. Heated stones wrapped in cloth, blankets warmed by the fire, hot broth in a pot on the stove. They laid Clara beside the fireplace and warmed her slowly, carefully, the way you warm a body that has gone too cold. You do not rush it. You do not pile on heat. You bring the warmth back gradually, patiently, the way spring comes to the prairie. Beckett sat beside her through the night. He fed the fire. He replaced the cooling stones with fresh ones. He held her hand. She was too cold and too exhausted to speak, but her fingers closed around his, and neither of them let go. Sometime in the deep hours, when the fire had burned low and Jonah had fallen asleep in the chair across the room, Clara opened her eyes. Beckett's face was inches from hers. His eyes were red. His jaw was tight. The hand that could split firewood all day without trembling was shaking as it gripped hers. "Do not ever do that again," he whispered. "Do what?" she breathed. "Nearly die." His voice broke on the word. "I cannot lose anyone else." Neither of them moved. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, and in the silence between them, something shifted that could never shift back. Something that had been building since the first night she arrived, since the mended shirt and the fixed hinge and the name spoken for the first time in the firelight of a burning barn. It filled the space between their faces like heat, like inevitability, like the first green shoot of spring pushing through frozen ground. Clara tightened her fingers around his hand. That was all. That was everything. Days later, when Clara had recovered and the snow had cleared enough for basic work, Beckett found her in the barn, brushing copper. He stood in the doorway for a long time, his silhouette framed against the gray winter light, before he spoke. "Clara." She turned. Something in his voice told her what was coming. The rawness, the deliberate quality, the sound of a man who had rehearsed these words 100 times and still did not know how to say them. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish." She set down the brush. She waited. "I fought this. God knows I fought it. You came here for my brother, and I spent months hating you for it. Hating you for being here. Hating myself for wanting you to stay. I told myself it was the ranch that we needed the help. But that was a lie." His hands were clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid with the effort of vulnerability. "I am in love with you, Clara. I have been in love with you since the night you carried that foal out of the burning barn. Maybe before. I do not know. But I know it now, and I cannot pretend I do not." The horses breathed in their stalls. Wind slipped through the barn boards. The world outside was white and still. I am not asking for anything, he said quickly, his jaw tight. I know you came here for Silas. I know you are keeping his promise. I would not take that from you, even if I could. But you deserve the truth. I could not let another winter pass without saying it. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not because his words were unwelcome. That was what terrified her, because they opened a door she had been trying desperately to keep shut. You are a good man, Beckett Calloway, she said softly. And if things were different, she stopped herself. But they are not. I made a promise. Silas may be gone, but the promise is not. I am here to build what he dreamed of, and I cannot do that if I... She swallowed. I cannot. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I do not know. Beckett nodded. His face was a mask of controlled pain. I understand. He turned and walked out of the barn. Clara watched him go and pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from calling him back. This was not a rejection. It was a deferral. She had not said no. She had said not yet, and both of them knew it. 2 weeks later, a package arrived from the Fort Worth post office. Silas Calloway's personal effects. Clara opened the battered saddlebag at the kitchen table with both brothers present. Inside, she found a worn Bible with a cracked spine, a leather pouch containing $47 in gold and silver coins, a pocket knife with a bone handle, and a small leather box. She opened the box. Inside, resting on a scrap of cloth, was a gold ring, simple, unadorned, warm in her fingers, as though it remembered being worn. She held it up to the lamplight and turned it slowly. Inside, the band, engraved in letters so small she had to squint to read them, were 3 words. Through every winter. Jonah made a sound. Soft, broken, beautiful. That was our mother's wedding ring, he said, his voice thick. Father kept it in his desk after she passed. Silas must have taken it before he left. The ring changed everything. Silas Calloway had not simply placed an advertisement in a newspaper. He had taken his mother's wedding ring, the most precious thing his family owned, and carried it 1,000 miles with the intention of placing it on the finger of a woman he had never met. This was not a transaction. This was not an arrangement. This was a man who had made a promise with the only currency that mattered. Clara slipped the ring onto a chain and hung it around her neck beneath her dress against her heart, where it would stay until the man who was meant to give it to her could do so himself. She no longer believed he was dead. She could not explain why. The letter from Texas was official, specific, detailed, but something in her refused to accept it. Perhaps it was the ring. Perhaps it was the unfinished letter on his desk. Perhaps it was simply the stubbornness that had carried her 1,000 miles and through fire and blizzard and heartbreak. Or perhaps it was something Martha had said weeks ago in her warm kitchen, with tea growing cold between them. Silas Calloway is the kind of man who keeps his promises, even when the world says he cannot. Winter always ends. Confirmation came from an unexpected source. Rose McAllister appeared at the ranch on a cold Tuesday in late December, her breath white in the frozen air, her face stripped of the challenge and confidence Clara remembered from the general store. She looked smaller, younger, afraid. I need to tell you something, Rose said, standing on the porch, her gloved hands twisting together. Harding paid me. Last summer when I said those things to you in the store about Silas and me having an understanding, Harding put me up to it. He thought if he could shake you, make you doubt Silas, you might leave. And if you left, the brothers would fall apart. They were already halfway there before you came. Clara absorbed this with the outward calm she had perfected over weeks of practice. But inside, a door was opening. And the letter, the one saying Silas was killed, Rose's eyes widened. I do not know anything about a letter, but if Harding paid me to lie, he could pay someone to write anything. The realization hit the ranch like a thunderclap in a clear sky. The death notice might be false. Another of Harding's weapons. Another forgery like the debt. Silas might be alive. Out there somewhere in the vast country between Texas and Wyoming, fighting his way home. Hope, when it returns after prolonged grief, is almost more painful than the grief itself. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. Beckett went still in that particular way he had the stillness before action, before decision, before the world changed. Jonah sat down heavily and put his face in his hands. We cannot know for certain, Jonah said. But we cannot give up, Clara said. Not now, not ever. Harder things have been survived. The debt deadline arrived on a bitter morning in the middle of January. The snow lay deep across the prairie, and the sky was the color of old pewter. Victor Harding rode up to the ranch in his polished black buggy, accompanied by Sheriff Tom Hutchins, the county clerk Reeves, and 4 hired men on horseback. Harding was dressed immaculately. Black coat, silver watch chain, hat freshly brushed. His expression was one of practiced regret, the face of a man who had rehearsed his sympathy in a mirror. "I take no pleasure in this," Harding said, stepping down from the buggy. "But the law is the law. The debt is due. Do you have the payment?" Beckett, Jonah, and Clara stood on the porch. Beckett had his rifle leaning against the wall within reach, not pointed at anyone, simply present. A statement. Jonah stood with his arms crossed, his young face set hard as the frozen ground. Clara stood between them, chin lifted, the cameo brooch at her throat, catching the thin winter light. "We have $732, Clara said, her voice clear and steady. "We request an extension of 60 days to raise the remainder." "I am afraid that is not possible." Harding shook his head. The terms were clear: full payment or forfeiture. Sheriff Hutchins shifted uncomfortably on his horse. He was 51 years old, honest to his marrow, but caught between that honesty and the machinery of power that Harding controlled. "Mr. Harding, if they are making a good faith effort—" "The law does not recognize good faith, Sheriff. It recognizes debts and payments." Beckett stepped forward. "This debt is a lie. My father never borrowed a cent from you. That document is a forgery, and you know it." Harding's expression did not flicker. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Calloway. I trust you have evidence." Silence. They did not have evidence. Clara's letters to Denver had gone unanswered. The judge was in Harding's pocket. The system had failed them. "Very well," Harding said, reaching into his coat for the legal papers. "I hereby serve notice of—" He did not finish the sentence, because that was when they heard it. Hoofbeats, faint at first, then growing louder, coming from the South Trail. Every head turned. Through the gray winter light, a rider appeared at the edge of the tree line. Tall, broad-shouldered, hunched slightly in the saddle, as though carrying a wound or a weight. Behind him on a mule rode a small figure wrapped in a buffalo robe. The rider cleared the trees and entered the yard. He stopped. He lifted his head. Beckett made a sound that was not a word and not a cry, but something deeper, something torn from a place beyond language. Jonah whispered 2 words, "Oh, God." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Silas Calloway was alive. He was thinner than the man who had left. His face was gaunt, carved by hunger and hard miles and suffering that would take months to tell. A ragged scar cut across his left temple. His clothes were torn. His horse was borrowed. His boots were held together with strips of rawhide. He looked 10 years older than the man who had ridden away. But his eyes were the same. Amber gold, intense, alive with a fierce intelligence that no stampede or bullet or Texas jail cell had managed to extinguish. He swung down from the saddle. He swayed. He steadied himself against the horse with one hand and looked across the yard at the porch, at his brothers, at the woman standing between them. For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. Silas Calloway looked at Clara Whitfield, and his expression cracked open. She was smaller than he had imagined, more beautiful. She was standing on his porch wearing a look of such overwhelming emotion that it stopped the breath in his chest and made the 1,000 miles and the months of pain and the blood he had spilled worth every single step. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was deeper than his letters, rougher, damaged by illness and exposure and the things he had survived to reach this moment. "Mr. Calloway," she whispered, "I'm sorry I am late." Tears spilled down her face. She descended the porch steps on legs that barely held her. "You are here. That is all that matters. You are home now." Silas turned to Harding. The land baron's composure had fractured for the first time in anyone's memory. He had not expected this. Dead men do not ride home. "Victor Harding," Silas said, and his voice carried across the frozen yard like the sound of a hammer striking iron. "I believe you and I have business." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a leather satchel. Inside were documents from the Territorial Banking Commission in Denver. Official records proving that no loan of $2,000 had ever been issued to Henry Calloway by any party, including Victor Harding. Depositions from 2 witnesses who had seen Harding meeting with a known forger in Denver shortly after Henry Calloway's death. Silas laid the documents on the porch railing. "This debt is a fraud. You forged my father's signature to steal our land for the railroad right-of-way. I have the proof." He looked at the sheriff. "Sheriff Hutchins, I am filing a formal complaint. I want this man arrested." Harding's mask fell away completely. The charming land baron disappeared. In his place stood a desperate, cornered man watching his empire collapse in a snow-covered ranch yard. He turned to his hired men. The signal was subtle, a tightening of his jaw, a slight nod. The men moved toward their horses, toward the rifles sheathed in their saddle scabbards. But the Callaways were city. Beckett had his rifle. Jonah had moved to the barn door where a shotgun hung on 2 pegs. And Claire stood between the porch and the yard holding the documents against her chest, her body a shield for the evidence that could save everything they had fought for. Sheriff Hutchins stepped his horse forward. This was his moment. The moment that would define whether he was a lawman who served the truth or a puppet who served power. He looked at Harding. He looked at the documents. He looked at Clara, this small, fierce woman from Boston, who was standing in a Wyoming winter, holding the truth against her heart. "Mr. Harding," the sheriff said slowly, "I think you had better come with me to town." Harding's men hesitated. Without their employer's confidence to push them forward, they faltered. Beckett raised his rifle, not aiming, just present. Jonah emerged with the shotgun. The arithmetic of the situation was simple and final. Harding was escorted to Elk Ridge under the sheriff's authority. His hired men drifted away like smoke. The forged debt was dead. The ranch was saved. But on the porch of the Callaway Ranch, as the buggy disappeared over the ridge and the winter sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, the harder work was just beginning. Because Silas Callaway had come home, and home had changed in his absence. And so had he. And beside him, silent on a borrowed mule, a 7-year-old boy named Samuel stared at the ranch with enormous dark eyes and did not speak because he had not spoken a single word since the day his parents died on a burned-out wagon trail, and a stranger with amber eyes and scarred hands had lifted him from a creek bed and carried him north through the snow. The stranger had said, "You are safe now, you are home." The boy had not answered, but he had held on, and he had not let go. That first evening, all 4 of them sat at the kitchen table together. 4 chairs filled for the first time since Clara had arrived. The lamp cast warm light across the rough wood surface, across the plates of stew Clara had heated across the faces of 3 brothers who had not been in the same room in nearly a year. Samuel sat on the floor in the corner, wrapped in a wool blanket Jonah had pulled from the cedar chest, his back pressed against the wall and his knees drawn to his chest. His dark eyes tracked every movement in the room with the hypervigilance of a small animal that had learned the hard way what happened when you stopped watching. Jonah had placed a bowl of stew near him. The boy had not touched it. He would not eat unless the food was placed directly into his hands. Silas ate slowly as though his body had forgotten how to process a full meal. He was thinner than his brothers, remembered his cheekbones sharper, his wrists showing the bones beneath the skin. The scar across his left temple was angry and knew a jagged line that began at his hairline and disappeared into the stubble above his ear. His hands wrapped around the warm bowl trembled with a fine, constant vibration that he could not control. "Tell us," Beckett said. It was the first complete sentence he had spoken to his brother since the embrace in the yard when he had gripped Ella so hard that both of them staggered. 2 words. But from Beckett, 2 words could carry the weight of a year. Silas set down his spoon. He looked at the lamp flame for a long moment, and then he began. The cattle drive had started well. 2,000 head from the Brazos country in Texas, bound for the railhead in Kansas. Good money. The kind of money that could clear the debts their father had left and put the ranch on solid ground. Silas had signed on as second trail boss riding point and managing the lead cattle, sleeping 3 hours a night and spending the other 21 in the saddle. He described the drive in the spare, precise language of a man who had lived every mile. The dust that coated everything turning white shirts brown and brown horses gray. The sound of 2,000 cattle moving across open country, a low rolling thunder that never stopped day or night. The river crossings where the herd had to be funneled through narrow banks, and any hesitation could cause a pileup that would crush men and animals alike. The storms that came without warning across the flat country, Lightning walking across the prairie on legs of white fire while the cattle bellowed and surged. He had earned good money, saved nearly every dollar, wrote letters to Clara when he could, posting them at whatever settlement or relay station the drive passed through. He carried her letters in the breast pocket of his shirt, folded small and soft from reading. He carried the ring in a small leather box tucked deep inside his saddlebag, alongside the money he was saving. At night, when the herd was bedded and the other cowboys were asleep, he would take out the box, hold the ring up to the firelight, and read the inscription his father had chosen for his mother 30 years ago. Through every winter, he would think about a woman in Boston with cornflower blue eyes, in a way of writing that made him believe she was exactly what his letter said she was: honest, strong, worth writing home to. Near the Red River, everything went wrong. A thunderstorm hit at 3 in the morning. Lightning struck a cottonwood tree 50 yards from the herd, and the sound was like a cannon fired at point-blank range. 2,000 cattle surged to their feet and ran. Stampede, the most terrifying word in a cowboy's vocabulary, a wave of horns and hooves and blind animal panic that crushed everything in its path. 3 cowboys died in the first 60 seconds. Silas's horse went down rolling, and Silas went with it. He remembered the impact. He remembered the sound of his ribs cracking. He remembered the hooves passing over him, one striking his head with a force that turned the world white and then black. He woke up in a settlement called Miller's Creek, in a bed that smelled of lye soap and sickness. A frontier doctor named Aldrich had pulled him from the mud, set his ribs, and stitched the gash across his temple. Fever followed. Weeks of it. Delirious burning, lost in dreams where he rode endlessly across a prairie that had no horizon and no end. The doctor told him later that he had nearly died twice. Once from the head wound, once from the infection that followed. It took 2 months before he could sit a horse again. By then, the trail drive was long over. The money he had earned was in his saddlebag at the camp where the stampede had happened, and someone had sent a letter to Wyoming reporting him dead. Silas paused here. He looked at the table, at his scarred hands, at the ring of lamplight on the wood. I found out later who sent that letter. A man named Crawley. Harding hired him to follow the drive. His job was to make sure that if I did not die on the trail, the world would believe I had. The silence at the table was absolute. Clara's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Jonah had stopped eating. Beckett sat motionless, his jaw set like granite. Silas continued. When he was well enough to ride, he tracked Crawley to Fort Worth. He found him in a boarding house near the stockyards. The confrontation was brief. Crawley drew a revolver. Silas was faster, but not by choice. He shot Crawley in self-defense and was arrested the same hour. He spent 3 weeks in a Fort Worth jail cell while a judge heard testimony from the boarding house owner and 2 drovers who had witnessed the fight. He was cleared. The judge ruled justifiable self-defense. But 3 weeks in a Texas jail had cost him time he did not have, and the experience had left marks that did not show on his body. He did not elaborate on what those weeks had been like. He did not need to. The way he looked at the walls of the cabin, at the closed door, at the spaces between the windows, told the story his words did not. After his release, Silas made a decision. He rode to Denver, a detour of hundreds of miles, weeks of travel through mountain passes already filling with early snow. In Denver, he went to the Territorial Banking Commission and spent 2 weeks arguing with clerks, filing requests, sitting in waiting rooms, and systematically building the case against Victor Harding. He found the records proving that no loan had ever been issued to Henry Callaway. He obtained depositions from witnesses. He assembled the evidence that would destroy the forged debt and expose Harding's scheme to steal the Callaway land for the railroad right-of-way. And then on the trail north from Denver, he found Samuel. Silas's voice changed when he spoke about the boy. It became softer, more careful, as though the words themselves might bruise if he spoke them too loudly. The wagon had been burned, an ordinary settler's wagon, the kind that carried families west every spring by the thousands. The young couple inside had been killed by outlaws. Their belongings were scattered across the frozen ground. Clothes, tools, a Bible with a family name written on the flyleaf. And in the creek bed 20 yards away, hidden beneath an overhang of roots and frozen mud, a boy, 7 years old, alive, silent. Samuel had not spoken since the attack. Not a word, not a sound. He communicated through his eyes, which were enormous and dark and filled with a knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess. He ate when food was placed in his hands. He slept when exhaustion took him. He followed Silas the way a lost animal follows the first creature that does not hurt it. With caution, with patience, with a desperate, wordless hope. "I could not leave him," Silas said. His voice was quiet, steady, final. "He needed a home. We have a home." He looked at Clara. "I know I should have asked first. I know this was not part of any arrangement or any letter. But I looked at that boy, and I saw myself at 12 years old standing in the kitchen of this house after they put my father in the ground. No parents, no one coming to save me. Just my brothers and this land, and the choice to keep going or give up." He paused. "I chose to keep going. I thought maybe he deserved the same chance." Clara stood from the table. She crossed the room to the corner where Samuel sat with his untouched bowl. She knelt beside him, slowly, the way Silas knelt when he spoke to the boy, not towering over him, meeting him at his level. She picked up the bowl of stew and held it in front of him, not pushing, not insisting, simply offering. Samuel's eyes searched her face. Whatever he found there, whatever he read in those cornflower blue eyes that had crossed a continent and survived fire and blizzard and heartbreak, it was enough. His small hand reached out. He took the bowl. He ate. Clara looked up at Silas across the room. Their eyes met for the first time without the urgency of crisis between them, and something passed between them that was not the wild electricity she felt when Beckett's shoulder touched hers, and was not the comfortable warmth of Jonah's steady friendship, but something else entirely, something quieter, something deeper. A recognition, as though two people who had been writing to each other in the dark had finally stepped into the same light and discovered that the person they had been corresponding with was exactly who they had hoped. Silas looked away first, but he was smiling. The first real smile Clara had seen on his face, and it transformed him. The gaunt, scarred, exhausted man disappeared for a moment, and in his place was the man who had written those careful, honest letters. Patient, steady, worth waiting for. The conversation between Silas and Beckett happened outside by the corral in the bitter cold of a January evening. The brothers stood with their hands on the top rail of the fence, their breath making clouds in the frozen air, the horses moving in quiet circles behind them. Clara did not hear the conversation. Neither did Jonah. But through the kitchen window, they watched the brothers' silhouettes against the darkening sky. They watched the way Silas leaned toward Beckett, his hand on his brother's shoulder. They watched the way Beckett's head dropped his forehead, nearly touching the fence rail. They watched the way the two men stood in the cold for a long time after the words ran out, not speaking, not moving, just standing together in the silence that brothers share when the truth has finally been spoken. What Clara learned later through the fragments Silas shared and the things Beckett did not deny was this. Silas knew about Beckett's feelings for Clara. He had seen it the moment he rode into the yard, the way Beckett stood next to her, the way his body oriented toward hers like a compass needle finding north, the way he could not meet his brother's eyes. Silas did not rage. He did not accuse. He asked one question. "Did you act on it?" "No." And then with the honesty that had always been the Calloway family's curse and salvation. "But I wanted to. Every single day I wanted to." Silas was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice carried no anger, only a weariness that went deeper than the physical. "You took care of her when I could not. You rode through a blizzard to save her life. I will never forget that. And I will never hold against you the fact that you loved her while you did it." Oh, Paul, but she came here for me, Beckett. She answered my letter. She made a choice, and I need the chance to see if we can build what I promised. Beckett nodded. He did not trust his voice. He turned and walked into the barn, and what he did alone in the darkness between the horse stalls was his own business, and the story does not follow him there, because some griefs are too private even for words. The days that followed were strange and tender and awkward, in ways that made Jonah, watching from the edges, press his fist against his mouth more than once to keep from smiling. Silas and Clara were strangers who were also engaged to be married. They had exchanged letters. They had shared words on paper, but they had never sat across a table and looked into each other's eyes. And the distance between writing and being, between imagining and knowing turned out to be wider than either of them expected. Silas was a man accustomed to solitude and hardship, not conversation and domesticity. He did not know how to sit in a room with a woman and simply exist. He fidgeted with his hat. He started sentences and abandoned them halfway through. He looked at Clara with such intensity that she blushed and turned away, which made him blush and turn away, and the cycle repeated itself 3 or 4 times an evening until one of them found something urgent to do in another room. Clara discovered that the man she had imagined from his letters was both more and less than the man sitting across from her. He was quieter than she expected, more comfortable with silence than with speech. He was physically larger than she had imagined, his presence filling a room in a way his careful handwriting never suggested. And he was gentler than she had dared to hope. She watched him with Samuel, the way he knelt to the boy's level every time he spoke to him, the way he never raised his voice, the way he placed food in the boy's hands without comment or fuss and sat near him in the evenings, without requiring anything in return, simply creating a space where safety existed and the boy could take it or leave it as he chose. She watched a man who knew what it meant to be broken, handling a broken child with the patience of someone rebuilding a watch, one tiny gear at a time. One afternoon, Clara found Silas sitting alone on the porch, staring at the mountains with an expression that was equal parts peace and pain. She sat beside him without speaking. After a long while, he said, "I was afraid you would be disappointed. The letters. I took my time with them. Chose every word. In person, I am not good with words." "You do not need to be—" Clara said. "You rode through stampedes and gunfights in a Texas jail to get home. You carried proof across the mountains to save this ranch. You found a child in a frozen creek bed and brought him to safety. Those are not words, Silas. Those are better than words. Actions, not words." He looked at her then, really looked. Not the quick, averted glances he had been managing since his return, but a full, steady, searching gaze that took in her face the way a man takes in a landscape he intends to memorize. And she saw in his eyes the man who had written those letters. Patient, honest, steady, full of a love he did not quite know how to express, but expressed anyway in everything he did. One evening by the fireplace, while Jonah had gone to his room and Beckett was at the barn, and Samuel was asleep on the rug, with a carved wooden horse clutched in his fist, Silas took Clara's hand. It was the first time they had touched deliberately. His hand was large, rough-scarred from years of rope and leather and hard use. Hers was smaller, calloused from months of ranch work, bearing the faint shine of healed burns from the night of the fire. They fit together imperfectly, which is to say, they fit together the way real things fit, with friction, with texture, with the warmth that comes from contact between two surfaces that have been shaped by the world. "Clara Whitfield," he said softly, "will you still marry me?" "I traveled 1,000 miles and waited through 3 seasons," she said. "The answer has always been yes." He smiled, that transforming smile that made the scars and the weariness disappear and left nothing but the man who had written, "I will be at the station when you arrive." He had been late, but he had come. Through every winter. The wedding was 2 weeks later. Beckett came to see Clara the day before, and the conversation they had on the porch in the thin winter sunlight was the one she had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "I am leaving the ranch," Beckett said. Her heart dropped. "Beckett, no. Not leaving, not really." He said it quickly before her face could finish falling. "There is a quarter section of open land on the northern ridge, 3 miles from here. Good grass, a creek. Shelter from the north wind. I am going to homestead it, build my own place." He paused, his jaw worked. "Close enough to ride over for Sunday supper. Far enough that—" He stopped. "Far enough that I do not have to watch you with him every day." He did not say it. He did not need to. Clara's eyes filled. She reached out and took his hand. Briefly, gently. The only time she would allow herself this. "You are a good man, Beckett Calloway. That is what good men do. They build." "So everyone keeps telling me," he said, and there it was, the ghost of the old, sharp grin, battered but alive like a flag still flying after a storm. Starting to think they might be right. He rode north the next morning before dawn. Jonah watched him go from the barn doorway. For the first time in this story, the youngest brother looked his age. A 24-year-old boy watching his family change its shape. But Jonah also looked toward the northern ridge where Beckett's silhouette was growing smaller against the brightening sky, and he understood what his brothers sometimes missed. The family was not breaking. It was rearranging itself the way a river rearranges itself around a new stone. The water still flows. The current still holds. The river is still the same river. It simply finds a new way forward. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early February 1879. It was a winter wedding because these people had waited long enough and winter was their season. They had been forged by it, tested by it, strengthened by it. To wait for spring would have been dishonest. They were winter people. Their love had been born in the cold. Martha Davies took charge of the preparations with the organizational ferocity of a woman who had been waiting 40 years to plan a wedding. She commandeered the church, recruited 3 neighbor women to cook, and assigned tasks with a precision that would have impressed a cavalry officer. Jonah built a wooden arch for the church doorway and carved it with a pattern of wild roses and wheat sheaves that made Clara cry when she saw it. "It is just wood," he mumbled, embarrassed. She hugged him so tightly he had to tap her shoulder and wheeze, "Cannot breathe, Clara." Silas, tasked with writing his vows, produced 6 drafts. Each one was crossed out and crumpled. He appeared at Martha's kitchen door at midnight, wild-eyed, holding a blank piece of paper. "I cannot write vows," he said. "Every word sounds wrong." Martha poured him coffee, sat him down, and fixed him with the look she reserved for men who were making simple things complicated. "Then do not write. Just tell her the truth. You are good at that." Silas stared at the blank paper for a long time. Then he folded it, put it in his pocket, and nodded. Clara's dress was a community effort. Gus Harmon donated a bolt of white cotton from his store. Martha cut the pattern. A young wife from a neighboring homestead, Emily Tucker, did the fine stitching. Clara sewed the final seams herself, sitting by the window in Martha's kitchen, the winter light catching the fabric. It was not silk, it was not fashionable, but it was beautiful the way simple, honest things are beautiful, because it was made with care by hands that wished her well. The night before the wedding, Clara sat alone in the room that had been Silas's and would tomorrow become theirs. She read his letters one final time, all of them from the first careful reply to the last. She traced his handwriting with her finger. This was the man. This was the man who had written these words, who had ridden 1,000 miles, who had kept his promise through every season. Tomorrow he would be her husband. The words sat in her chest like a warm stone, solid, certain, real. The small church in Elk Ridge was full. Every chair occupied, every wall lined with standing neighbors, every window steamed with the warmth of bodies and breath. Martha Davies sat in the front row, weeping into a handkerchief and making no effort whatsoever to disguise it. Gus Harmon sat behind her hat in his lap, nodding slowly, as though confirming something he had suspected all along. Sheriff Hutchins stood at the back, finally at peace with a conscience that had cost him sleep for months. Rose McAllister was there. Last row, quiet. Her face held something that might have been regret or might have been release. She met Clara's eyes briefly as the bride entered and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an apology, it was an acknowledgement. Between women who have both loved the same man, it was enough. Samuel sat beside Jonah in the second row, clean, dressed in a new shirt that Jonah had cut from flour sacking and stitched with surprising skill for a man whose hands were built for barn timbers. The boy's dark hair was combed. His carved wooden horse was clutched in his fist. He had not spoken, but his eyes were calmer than they had been the day he arrived, and he sat close to Jonah with the trusting proximity of a child who has decided that at least one adult in the world is safe. Beckett rode in from the northern ridge at dawn. He had not been invited because he did not need to be. He was family. He stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands and his face carefully composed, and his heart doing whatever it was doing behind the wall he had built for it. Clara walked up the aisle in her white cotton dress with the cameo brooch at her throat. Her honey blonde hair was loose in soft curls. A small cluster of dried wildflowers pinned at her temple. Martha's contribution and Martha's command. No bride of mine is walking down that aisle without flowers. I do not care if they are dead ones. She was not the trembling girl who had stepped off the stagecoach 4 months ago. She was a woman who had survived fire and blizzard and grief, who had carried a foal through smoke and ridden through darkness and stood on a porch holding the truth against her chest while armed men decided the fate of everything she loved. She walked towards Silas with steady steps and clear eyes, and every person in that church felt the weight of what she had earned. Silas stood at the front in a borrowed suit that fit him poorly, too tight across his broad shoulders, too short in the sleeves. He looked uncomfortable in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors always look uncomfortable in formal clothing, as though the fabric itself were a kind of captivity. But when he saw Clara walking toward him, his expression collapsed. Every wall he had built, every defense he had raised, every mile he had ridden, and every pain he had endured crumbled away. And what was left was the raw, unprotected face of a man who understood in that moment what all the winters of his life had been for. She reached him. Her hand slipped into his. "You waited for me," he whispered. "Through every winter," she whispered back. The preacher spoke. The words were old and familiar words spoken over countless couples in countless small churches across the frontier. But for Clara and Silas, each word carried the specific weight of their own improbable journey. The promises they made to each other were not hypothetical. In sickness and in health, they had already been sick. They had already been apart. For richer, for poorer, they had already been poor. They had already nearly lost everything. The vows were not predictions. They were descriptions of what had already been survived. When the moment came, Silas reached into his pocket and produced the gold ring, his mother's ring, the ring that had traveled from Virginia to Wyoming in a young bride's hand, and then from Wyoming to Texas in a young man's saddlebag, and then from Texas back to Wyoming through stampede and gunfire and jail and blizzard. The ring that Clara had worn on a chain against her heart for weeks waiting for this moment. The ring she had returned to Silas the night before with a kiss on his scarred cheek and the words, "Put it on my finger where it belongs." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The inscription inside caught the light from the church windows. 3 words that had held them together across 1,000 miles in 100 terrible days. Through every winter, the kiss was brief and tender, a promise sealed, a journey completed, a future begun. The congregation erupted in cheers that rattled the windows and sent the pigeons on the church roof into startled flight. That evening, back at Callaway Creek Ranch, the celebration filled the house and spilled into the yard. Lanterns hung from the porch eaves. A neighbor brought a fiddle and played until his fingers cramped and then played more. Food appeared from every direction, dishes carried across miles of frozen prairie by people who had watched Clara struggle and had come to witness her joy. Jonah danced with Martha and spun the old woman so enthusiastically that she laughed until tears streamed down her face and she had to sit down and fan herself with a hymnal. Samuel stood near the door watching the festivities with wide eyes, his wooden horse in one hand and a piece of cake in the other, the first sweet thing he had tasted in months. Beckett arrived at dusk. He dismounted, tied his horse, and crossed the yard with the measured stride of a man walking toward something that hurt and something that healed in equal measure. He shook Silas's hand at the porch steps. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually last. Neither brother spoke. Neither needed to. When Clara saw Beckett across the yard, she went to him. She hugged him briefly and fiercely, her arms barely reaching around his broad frame. He closed his eyes for one moment. One single moment in which everything he felt passed through him like a river passing through a canyon, enormous and powerful, and ultimately moving on, carrying what it carried to wherever rivers go. "Take care of him," Beckett said. "Take care of yourself," Clara replied. He mounted his horse and rode north toward the ridge. The last lantern light caught him at the tree line before the darkness took him. He did not look back. A man keeps his word. And Beckett Callaway had made himself a promise he would build something of his own. He would not break. He would not grow bitter. He would be the kind of man that the woman he loved would have been proud of even if she never knew. Winter always ends, even the winters of the heart. As the celebration wound down and the guests departed into the cold starlit night, Silas and Clara stood on the porch together. The prairie was silver blue under the moon. The wind was almost gentle, carrying the faint sound of the creek and the distant call of an owl. Inside, Jonah was reading to Samuel by the fire, his quiet voice carrying through the open door like a lullaby. Silas put his arm around Clara's shoulders. She leaned into him, into the warmth and solidity of this man who had kept his promise, who had ridden through dust and blood and winter to come home. "What now?" she asked softly. Now, he said, we build. The door closed softly behind them. Outside, the first snow of February began to fall, fine and light, catching the moonlight, turning the world white and clean and new. Spring came to the Wyoming Territory the way it always comes to hard country, slowly, grudgingly, and then all at once. The snow retreated up the mountains. The creek ran high and clear with snowmelt. The prairie erupted in wildflowers so thick and vivid that from a distance the land looked like a quilt stitched by someone who loved color. Meadowlarks returned. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass and the sweet, sharp scent of cottonwood buds opening. The ranch transformed. The new barn Jonah had been building all winter stood complete, its fresh-cut timbers golden in the sunlight. The corral expanded to hold the horses that Silas was buying from a rancher to the south. Clara's garden broke ground in April, the same plot where Sarah Calloway had once grown beans and squash, the soil dark and rich and ready. Silas and Jonah worked on the house expansion through the spring, adding a room for Samuel, then another room because Silas had a look in his eye when he measured the timber that suggested he was planning for a family larger than the one they had. Clara watched him work from the kitchen window while she kneaded bread, and she understood exactly what those extra measurements meant, and the knowledge made her smile in a way that started deep in her chest and did not stop until it reached her eyes. The construction details mattered. They mattered to the story, and they mattered to the men. Cutting timber, selecting straight trunks of lodgepole pine, felling them with a two-man crosscut saw, Silas on one end and Jonah on the other, the rhythm of the blades singing back and forth between them. Debarking each log with a draw knife, notching the corners so the logs locked together without nails. Raising the walls with a block and tackle rigged from a cottonwood tree, each log hoisted into place with ropes and sweat and language that Clara pretended not to hear. Chinking the gaps with a mixture of clay and dried grass pressed in with bare hands sealed against the wind. Built this with our own hands. Samuel's first word came on a Tuesday morning in April, 2 months after the wedding. It happened without warning and without ceremony. He was sitting at the breakfast table watching Clara pour coffee, the way he watched everything with those enormous dark eyes that missed nothing. Silas sat across from him eating biscuits and reading a letter from the land office. Jonah was outside hammering. Samuel looked at Silas. He opened his mouth, and he spoke. Home. One word, quiet, rough from months of disuse, but unmistakable. Silas set down his coffee cup. He looked at the boy. The boy looked back. And in that exchange of gazes, something completed itself. A circuit closed. A promise made on a frozen creek bed months ago was finally fully kept. Silas knelt beside the boy's chair. He put his arms around his Samuel and held him. The boy's small body was stiff, at first rigid, with the memory of a world where being held meant nothing good. But Silas did not let go. He held on with the patience of a man who understood that trust, like timber, cannot be rushed. It must be shaped slowly. And after a while, Samuel's body softened. His arms came up. His small hands gripped the back of Silas's shirt, and he held on. From the kitchen, Clara watched through a blur of tears. She did not wipe them. Some tears are meant to fall. After that morning, Samuel added words the way Jonah added rooms, lowly, carefully, each one tested and found solid before the next was placed. He called Silas Sir. He called Jonah Y, a shortening that delighted the youngest brother beyond all reason. He called Clara Ma'am for 3 weeks. And then one morning, while she was braiding her hair at the kitchen table, and he was eating the oatmeal she had sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey, he looked up and said simply, Ma. Clara had to leave the kitchen. She stood on the porch with her hand over her mouth and her shoulders shaking and her heart so full that it felt like it might crack open like a seed and grow something she did not have a name for yet. When she came back inside, her eyes red, her smile enormous. Samuel was still eating his oatmeal. He did not look up, but the ghost of a smile crossed his face, quick and shy, and Clara knew that he had said the word on purpose. He had chosen her, the way she had once chosen a letter from a stranger, with hope, with trust, with the desperate, stubborn belief that somewhere in the world there was a place where you belonged. You are home now. On a warm morning in late April, as the prairie grass turned green and the meadowlarks filled the air with song, Clara took Silas's hand and placed it on her stomach. We are going to have a baby, she said. His eyes widened. His breath caught the way it had caught the moment he first saw her standing on his porch, his hand calloused and scarred and steady enough to control a 1,200-pound horse trembled against her. Clara. Late autumn, she said, smiling through tears. Our child will be born when the first snow comes. He gathered her into his arms, gently, as though she were made of something precious and breakable, though she was neither, and both of them knew it. I do not deserve this much happiness, he whispered into her hair. You do, she said. We both do, stronger together than apart. The baby was born in November on a night when the first snow of winter fell soft and quiet outside the window. A girl, dark-haired like her father, with her mother's blue eyes and a cry that filled the cabin, with the unmistakable sound of a new life demanding to be heard. Silas held her with trembling hands. Tears slipped down his scarred cheeks. She has your eyes, he whispered, and your stubbornness. I can already tell. What should we name her? Clara asked. He did not hesitate. Sarah, after my mother. Sarah Calloway, Clara whispered, touching the baby's cheek. Welcome home. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Jonah stood on the porch, listening to the newborn's cries and grinning so wide that his face ached. He had already started carving. A small wooden horse for the baby. Started early, he told himself. A man can never start building too early. The years turned the way years turn on a working ranch. Not in dramatic leaps, but in the slow accumulation of seasons, each one adding a layer to the life that Clara and Silas were building. By 1885, the ranch had doubled. New fences marked expanded pastures. 100 head of cattle grazed in the creek bottom. The house had grown from a two-room cabin to a proper home with a kitchen large enough to hold a table that Jonah had built and expanded twice. Sarah had siblings now. James, born in 1882, quiet and serious like his father. Henry, born in 1884, loud and stubborn and fearless, and the one who would climb any fence and ride any horse and argue with any adult foolish enough to tell him no. A fourth child, a daughter named Rose, would come in 1888, completing the family with a girl as gentle and perceptive as her uncle Jonah. Samuel grew tall and steady, a boy becoming a man in the careful, patient way of someone who had learned early that the world could break you and had decided that it would not. He worked alongside Silas from the age of 10, learning cattle the way Silas had learned them from Henry Calloway. He rarely spoke more than necessary. But when he did speak, people listened because Samuel Calloway, as he came to be known, had earned every word he said. Beckett's cabin on the northern ridge became a homestead, then a ranch, then a life. He cleared land, built fences, bought cattle with money he earned breaking horses for the army. He rode down to the main ranch every Sunday for supper, without fail arriving with news from his spread and leaving with leftovers wrapped in cloth and the warmth of a family that had rearranged itself but never broken. The anger that had once defined Beckett did not disappear. It was part of him the way the scar on Silas's temple was part of Silas. But it found new channels. He built with it. He worked with it. He turned it into fence posts and barn walls and corrals and the slow, steady construction of a life that was his own. Martha, who had never met a situation she could not improve through strategic interference, began mentioning a young school teacher from Missouri named Ellen Hayes who had recently arrived in Elk Ridge. 26, educated, reads books, alone. Martha delivered these facts to Beckett over Sunday supper with the studied casualness of a woman dropping breadcrumbs along a trail she wanted him to follow. A man on a homestead needs a woman. I am merely stating a fact. Beckett said nothing, but the following Sunday his shirt was pressed. Ellen Hayes became Ellen Calloway 18 months later. She was sharp and kind and unafraid of Beckett's silences, which she filled not with chatter, but with a quiet presence that matched his own. They had 3 children. Beckett built her a house with a porch that faced south toward the main ranch, so that on clear days she could see the smoke from Silas's chimney and know that the family was close. Jonah never left the main ranch. He became its architect and its heart, building everything the growing family needed. The new barn, the bunkhouse for hired hands, the schoolroom where Clara taught reading to every child within 20 miles. He married at 30 a gentle widow named Margaret, whom he met at a church fundraiser. She ran the only bookshop in Elk Ridge, a small room attached to the general store, and Jonah fell in love with her the way he fell in love with everything, quietly, completely, and with absolute certainty. He still read poetry every night. He still carved. The windowsill in Samuel's room held a growing menagerie of wooden animals, one for every Sunday that Beckett came to supper. Horse, cow, bear, eagle, elk. The boy lined them up in careful order and touched each one before bed. Years later, as a grown man, he would keep them on the mantelpiece of his own home, and his children would ask about them, and he would tell them about his uncles who had taught him that family is not something you are born into. It is something you build. Martha Davies died in 1897 at the age of 80 in her sleep in the small homestead she had maintained alone for 40 years. Clara sat beside her bed that final morning, holding the old woman's hand, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping me warm through my first winter." The house passed to a young family from Ohio, and Clara helped them settle in, carrying preserves and quilts and advice the way Martha had once carried them to her. By 1900, Silas Calloway was 54 years old. His hair was silver at the temples, and his back carried the permanent stoop of a man who had spent 3 decades bending to the work. But he was strong still and steady, and when he stood on the porch of the house that had grown from a cabin to a home, looking out over 2,000 acres of Callaway land, his eyes held the quiet satisfaction of a man who had kept every promise he ever made. Clara was 45. Her honey blonde hair carried threads of silver now, and her face bore the lines of 22 years of frontier, sun and wind and laughter. Her hands were capable and weathered and never still. She had taught 300 children to read. She had delivered 4 babies and raised 5 counting Samuel. She had survived fire, blizzard, or grief in 22 Wyoming winters, and she was stronger than she had ever been. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1900, the entire family gathered at the main ranch. The table that Jonah had built and rebuilt ran the length of the kitchen, and 14 people sat around it. Silas at the head, Clara at the foot. Between them, Sarah, 20 now, and nearly 21, with her mother's blue eyes and a teaching certificate from the normal school in Cheyenne. James, 18, already running the south pasture with the quiet competence of his father. Henry, 16, arguing with anyone who would engage and several who would not. Rose, 12, sitting beside Jonah and reading a book under the table when she thought no one was looking. Samuel, 29, tall and steady, his wife beside him, his hand resting on her shoulder. Beckett and Ellen, their 3 children, making noise enough for 6. Jonah and Margaret passing dishes and finishing each other's sentences the way couples do after a decade of practice. 14 people. The descendants and the chosen family of a man who had placed an advertisement in a newspaper and a woman who had answered it. Silas caught Clara's eye across the crowded table. The noise was enormous. Laughter and argument, and the clatter of spoons, and the high, bright voices of children who did not yet know that the world could be hard. But in the middle of all that noise, there was a silence between Silas and Clara that belonged only to them. He smiled, the same transforming smile she had seen for the first time in the lamplight of this kitchen 22 years ago. The smile that said, "Look what we built," she smiled back. On her finger, the gold ring thinner now after 2 decades of wear, but still catching the light, still holding its inscription. 3 words that had carried them across distance and silence and every kind of winter the world could devise. Built this with our own hands. That evening, as the guests departed and the children were put to bed and the house settled into the quiet that follows celebration, Clara stepped onto the porch. The prairie stretched before her in the blue-silver light of a spring moon. The creek sang its endless song. On the northern ridge, smoke rose from Beckett's chimney like a signal fire, steady and sure. Inside, Jonah was reading to Rose by the fire, his voice carrying through the door the way it had carried on 1,000 other evenings. Samuel's horse was tied at the rail, his shadow visible through the kitchen window as he helped his wife with the dishes before the ride home. Silas came out and stood beside her, his arms settled around her shoulders. She leaned into him the way she had leaned into him for 22 years. The way she would lean into him for 20 more until the day the Lord took one of them home and the other would wait patient and faithful until they were together again. "Remember," she said softly, "the day I stepped off the stagecoach in Elk Ridge? No one was waiting." "I was waiting," he said. "I was just a long way off." She laughed, a small, warm sound. The kind of laugh that can only exist between 2 people who have shared a life and survived it and would do it all again. She thought about the girl she had been, standing alone on a dusty street with a carpet bag and a letter and 19 cents and nothing else in the world. She thought about the woman she had become, Someone who had carried a foal through smoke and ridden through blizzards and stood on a porch holding the truth against her chest while armed men decided the fate of everything she loved. Someone who had answered a stranger's letter and found on the other side of 1,000 miles in 100 terrible days exactly what the letter had promised. A home, a family, a life built with her own two hands. She touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's brooch. Still there after all these years, the only thing she had brought from Boston that still remained besides herself. Silas's hand found hers, their fingers laced together the way they always did. His scarred and weathered, hers strong and certain. The gold ring pressed between their palms warm from her skin, worn smooth by years of work and love, and the ordinary, extraordinary labor of building a life on the frontier. Happy, he asked. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees. The creek ran over stones. The prairie breathed. And from inside the house, the sound of a page turning, as Jonah read on his quiet voice carrying a story within a story, words passing from the page to the air, to the ears of a child who would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Clara did not answer because the answer was everywhere. In the land, in the house, in the children sleeping under quilts she had sewn, in the ring on her finger and the brooch at her throat, in the smoke rising from Beckett's Ridge, and the sound of Jonah's voice, and the warmth of the man beside her, and the vast, enduring, generous silence of the Wyoming night. Some promises are worth keeping, some letters are worth answering, some winters are worth enduring, because on the other side of every winter there is spring. Through every winter. The Callaways are home.